from the heart of where innovation, money, and power collide. In Silicon Valley and beyond, this is Bloomberg Technology with Emily Chang.
I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, a conflict that will only get more brutal. U.S. officials warn more indiscriminate tactics coming from Russian forces in an attempt to suppress the Ukrainian resistance. We're live from the White House. Plus, Apple stopping all product sales in Russia, saying the company stands with all of the people who are suffering as a result of the violence. And Airbnb says it'll help shelter 100,000 Ukrainian refugees who fled their country as Russian forces continue their assault. My conversation with Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky later this hour. We're going to get to all of that in a moment, but first I want to get a look at the markets in the final moments of U.S. trading. Apple saying it's halted all product sales in Russia. Our Ed Ludlow with us now. Ed, what was the impact?
Yeah, I mean, the news story, the news flow intense over this Ukraine-Russian conflict, and the oil story front and center. You look at that monster move in your screen. We're still above $100 a barrel on WTI West Texas Intermediate. And that move higher in oil, despite the U.S. and other developed economies pledging to release stockpiles, rippled through risk assets. You see red on the screen with equities. The worry is that those higher energy prices adding to inflation. The worry is the situation in Ukraine and Russia impacting global growth. The S&P 500 down 1.5%. The NASDAQ 100 down 1.6%. That's despite a pretty sizable move lower in yields. You see bond markets advance. The US 10-year yield, the benchmark yield, down 10 basis points to 1.72%. It was just 20 days ago that we were above 2% on that US 10-year yield. Broadly, this is a commodity story. This is the impact from the conflict in Ukraine. Come with me into my Bloomberg terminal. Look at this chart. We've been focused on energy markets, oil and natural gas. This is industrial metals because now you see corporate America taking notice, taking action, not just in terms of removing their products from Russia, but also the impact to higher input costs that they now face. You see that the Bloomberg Industrial Metals Index rising by the most since December, but it's now at its highest level since 2011. This is what I'm talking about the inflation story coming out of the Ukraine-Russia situation, those higher impact costs and that impact to global growth. Of course, now the market also considering what the Federal Reserve does in the outlook for rates. Of course, specific stock stories we're looking at on Tuesday as well. Back to me in the studio. You have to start with supply chain. HP Inc., one of the biggest makers of PCs in the world, down 0.8% on Tuesday. Great quarter just gone. They're warning on profit this quarter. Why? Russia-Ukraine conflict. Lucid down 14%, not directly tied to conflict, but supply chain, cutting its outlook down from 20,000 vehicles to 12 to 14,000. Big tech is taking action now. You see all these statements coming out about removing Russian affiliated media from platforms. Meta down 4%, and Apple, as you said, Emily, the top line, pausing sales in Russia.
Ed, huge statement from Apple today. This from an Apple spokesperson. We've paused all product sales in Russia. Last week, we stopped all exports into our sales channel in the country. Apple Pay and other services have been limited. RT News and Sputnik News are no longer available for download from the App Store outside Russia. And we've disabled both traffic and live incidents in Apple Maps in Ukraine as a safety and precautionary measure for Ukrainian citizens. So certainly a number of very significant moves by Apple, standing in solidarity, essentially, with the Ukrainian people.
Yeah. The biggest company name in the world, the biggest action by corporate America today. You have to remember, Russia's a small part of sales. For Apple, you'll get into that with Mark Gurman later, but clearly a big statement. And by the way, just after Apple made that announcement, Ford followed suit, saying it is actually pausing its operations in Russia as well in partnership with its JV there. You see the stock down 0.3% in after hours.
All right, we're going to talk to Brian Chesky about Airbnb on the same issue as well later this hour. Ed, thank you. Meantime, Western military officials say Russia's invasion of Ukraine is entering a new phase, promising an even more deadly time ahead for Ukrainian civilians and its soldiers. I want to get now to our Bloomberg Washington correspondent, Anne-Marie Horton, standing by at the White House. Anne-Marie, President Biden spoke to President Zelensky earlier today. What is the latest that we know?
Yeah, they're certainly keeping in touch. The press secretary said that at least between the Ukrainians and the Americans, there's conversations almost daily. But the president spoke directly with President Zelensky today. And this is, of course, as Kharkiv, the second biggest city. There has been an onslaught in terms of that city, and many reporting that now a number of civilian places are being attacked. And then, of course, you have a very long road into Kiev that the Russians are just filling up. So you can see these two big cities are really starting to get either hit or encroached. And of course, the president speaking about that with the State of the Union, this has really changed the tone of his State of the Union speech, because a lot of the time presidents really want to focus on what's going on domestically. But given that we have this Russian invasion of Ukraine, the president is going to be focusing on that.
Absolutely. The State of the Union coming up. And certainly, what does President Biden have to reassure the American people about at this time, given the impact we're seeing on the economy and the concerns about rising inflation?
Yeah, this is really where the foreign policy meets the domestic, because what we're seeing on the foreign policy front is, of course, sanctions against Russia, incredibly harsh sanctions that are having a ripple effects across the financial community around the world, and especially in Russia's #1 industry, and that is fossil fuels, oil and gas. And that any sort of price premium we will see in the oil market, that will trickle down to individuals at the gasoline pump right here in America and across the world. But it's not only that, Emily. When you look at Russia, it is a commodity superstore. Wheat, massive export, palladium, aluminum, all of this feeds into the supply chain. So this is just going to make it harder for this administration to fight inflation, and that is their #1 domestic challenge.
All right, Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Horton in Washington at the White House. Anne-Marie, thank you. I want to get back to that Apple news, halting product sales in Russia. Joining me now, our very own Mark Gurman, who covers Apple. Obviously, this is a very significant statement from Apple. Mark, how big is Apple's business in Russia, and how will this impact the Russian people?
Yeah, I mean, Apple's business in Russia is pretty minimal, right? It is one component and not even close to the top of the biggest components in terms of their overall sales in Europe, which I believe is their third biggest market behind the U.S. And China and other parts of Asia. So in terms of the financial impact on Apple, I think it's going to be fairly minimal. This is them taking a stand on this issue. And you saw after Apple put their statement out, it came like Niagara Falls, a bunch of statements coming out after from Ford, from other companies, Universal, I saw from Nike, about them pausing their operations or slowing some of their ties to Russia as well.
Right. Apple saying in their statement, we join all those around the world who are calling for peace. I mean, do you expect more potential companies to be motivated by this, essentially, given that Apple, even though their business might be small there, is such an iconic company?
I mean, personally, I think you're going to see lots of companies in the Western world, whether that's in the U.S., in the U.K., elsewhere in Europe, really take a stand and pull their operations, or at least halt sales and operations in Russia. Apple was the big one, though, from a tech perspective, right? This was the biggest tech company by far that had direct-to-consumer sales in Russia. For over a decade now, or about a decade now, I should say, Apple has had a dedicated standalone online store in Russia, where you basically go to apple.com/ru/store and you could buy products as a citizen in Russia, and these are from an American company, right? So this was the big one. Apple probably had to do it, and they did it. And this is it's a very good symbol for the company and some of the social issues and policies that they stand on. So this is a plus for Apple, and you see other companies following suit now.
Right, and we know Apple CEO Tim Cook has taken a stand on a number of social issues since he's been leading the company. Okay, Mark Gurman, thank you. We'll see if other companies follow suit. Coming up, social networks scrambling to police content in the midst of Russian disinformation. I'm going to be joined by researcher Renee DiResta, who's spoken before Congress on these matters, to talk about how big tech companies can better combat foreign propaganda. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Twitter announcing that it's now labeling tweets affiliated with Russian state media, an effort the company says to, quote, significantly reduce the circulation of content pushed by the Russian government. Twitter also saying it'll put labels on other state-affiliated media outlets in coming weeks. My next guest says this is an important step as we examine the role of disinformation on social media. Joining me now, Renee DiResta. She is a research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. She spent years studying disinformation and even testified before Congress on these issues. Renee, great to have you back with us. So talk to us about the significance of labeling state-affiliated media. And is labeling enough, or should it be blocked entirely to stop the spread of disinformation?
These are really hard questions, Emily. Thanks for having me on. First of all, the labeling state media initiatives actually began in early 2020 when we started to see accounts out of China, Chinese state media, using Facebook ads in particular, to push false and misleading claims about COVID to audiences worldwide. That was one of the initial events that kind of precipitated the idea that people who are receiving information should know what the source is, particularly if the source is from an account linked to a foreign government. A lot of the conversation about disinformation on social media focuses on the bots and the trolls and the kind of covert chatter that comes and goes. You know, we see waves of accounts come and then get taken down. And those accounts are interesting. Those accounts can potentially shape a conversation, maybe participate in making something trend. But ultimately, state media accounts have standing audiences in the tens to hundreds of millions of followers. And these are the mouthpieces, the very overt, attributable broadcast mouthpieces that governments have built up over time to put their view of events out to the world. A conflict, sorry, go ahead.
Let's talk about that. In the current conflict, what are you seeing from Russian state-run media that is particularly alarming, and how widespread is it on big social platforms?
So what we're seeing is states using their media outlets to target different types of messages to different people depending on where they are. So Russia has not really done a whole lot targeting Western audiences in this particular conflict. We are not the audiences that they consider most relevant. They're really focusing their communication domestically on their own citizens, trying to create support for a conflict. And then they're focusing near to the conflict itself, trying to mislead the people of Ukraine, trying to make them think that their government is leaving, that their fighters are giving up, that the resistance is collapsing, to demoralize the public there. And that is where, and particularly in a situation like this, some of the false and misleading information, including that put out by state media, can have a significant degree of harm in the conflict area itself. So Western audiences or non-regional audiences are a wholly separate issue. They may be trying to shape public perception, but ultimately the thing that is of real concern that platforms are trying to be aware of is information from Russia targeting people in Ukraine or targeting people in the immediate region because they are trying to use the information war to bolster the shooting war.
And to your understanding, what has the impact of that been? I mean, we've heard reports from folks in Russia, folks who have family in Russia, that many of them don't have any idea the extent of what's really going on.
We've seen the same commentary from people, from even captured soldiers, who say we were told that they would welcome us. We were not told that this was what we were going to be going there for. So there's a whole lot to kind of unpack and try to understand in that dynamic. But one thing that's been really remarkable about this is the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian ministers, constantly on Twitter, constantly on social platforms, on Telegram and other places, telling the world what is actually happening, actively pre-bunking. You have President Zelensky regularly streaming himself, reinforcing the fact we are here, we are fighting. And so in that action, in that quite visible use of social media from the Ukrainian government, from the people of Ukraine, you are seeing a pretty remarkable pushback against Russia's efforts here. And this is where this question of what should be blocked, what should be allowed, the people are spending a lot of time actually kind of flooding the pages of Russian state media, leaving pro-Ukraine comments at this point. So I think the decision to respond to governments in Europe and others who want to see content either made inaccessible or temporarily blocked in certain regions makes sense in a particular part of the world that maybe is more directly impacted by certain types of misinformation, versus what we're seeing in the West, where American audiences can still go and see this content if they're so inclined.
Absolutely. The way that President Zelensky has been communicating with his people and with people around the world has been incredibly powerful. What do you think the platform should be doing? I mean, Meta announced it stopped recommending Russian state media to Facebook and Instagram users. Is that enough? Is it enough to do it now? Should it be, last beyond, when this war, or hopefully this war, is over?
That's a really challenging question. For a long time, we've had this idea, in America, that under something like the Foreign Agent Registration Act, we should know what foreign governments are saying. We should be able to receive that information, that communication. But in a time of crisis such as this, in a time in which life and death decisions can come about as a result of people seeing incorrect information, there are rules that are being put into play in the short term that need to be more carefully considered as we evaluate where to go in the long term.
Now, you talked about how difficult it is to discern misinformation on TikTok in particular. Is there something different about TikTok that makes it more of a minefield when it comes to misinformation, and why?
TikTok is, most people consume TikTok in their app. It's, I opened up my TikTok the other night, and the very first video that began to play was a video game, and it had a, nameless account. It was a shooting video game, first-person shooter. And they were claiming that this was a scene of a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And, Twitter has been pretty good about either labeling or throttling these, Facebook as well. But on TikTok, there it is with, kind of 1 million likes, and it's right there, the first thing that plays. And so the other thing that TikTok does not have is actually that very basic state media labeling. So when there is content that is produced by propagandists, the audience doesn't know. So this combination of content being repurposed, content being put out by an unverified or actively incentivized to harm kind of source, the people who are receiving the content on the platform can't tell. It takes them a lot of extra time to go and try to reverse image search a clip from a video, which is not something that is native or easy to do on a mobile phone when the information is being pushed to you. So I think that TikTok really lags its partners in the social media, of the big social media players, in not having these policies in place. And more importantly, we're seeing Meta and we're seeing Twitter reacting very quickly to either take down networks that they've found or to come up with these new labeling policies that are specifically tailored for the current events on the ground. And we don't really see TikTok following suit in that regard.
Interesting that you see TikTok being behind there. Thank you for helping us navigate some of these really thorny issues. Renee DiResta, researcher at the Stanford Internet Observatory. Good to have you with us. Coming up, is the Zoom glory over? We're going to talk with Zoom CFO Kelly Steckelberg after the company's projected sales this quarter fell short of Wall Street estimates, how it can earn back investor confidence. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Well, as more employees return to work in their offices, questions loom about whether Zoom's appeal during the pandemic era will fade. Zoom shares have declined by more than 75% from their October 2020 high. How will the company sustain growth beyond the pandemic boom? CFO Kelly Steckelberg with us now for more. Kelly, I have to ask you, given the geopolitical situation, your reaction to what we're seeing in Ukraine. Obviously, there's a humanitarian concern, but how are you viewing the impact on the economy and to potentially Zoom's business?
So, first of all, of course, our hearts go out to everyone impacted by this unfortunate situation. We feel lucky as an organization and a company that we don't have any employees that are directly impacted in either region. We do have some of their family members that are there, so we're doing everything that we can to help. And we have very minimal exposure from a revenue perspective in either of the two regions. So in terms of the impact that we expect directly on our business, it's really de minimis.
So let's talk about Zoom. As I said, there are questions about whether the glory days are over, and I'm sure that you will disagree. You're planning to stop reporting the number of customers with over 10 employees, pivot to reporting just the number of enterprise customers. Can you explain that change and what it means for this bigger picture?
Sure. So first of all, I just want to highlight we were very pleased with our results for FY22 that we reported yesterday, growing year over year 55% to over $4.1 billion. And as you highlighted, we really have seen tremendous growth in two parts of our business, which is the enterprise, which is that is touched by our direct, our channel, and our ISV partners. And then our online business, which is now approximately 50% of our business. So we are shifting metrics, as you mentioned, to focus on the enterprise, this is really where we see the long-term sustainable growth of our business. And we saw strong performance here with, customers with more than $100,000 of trailing 12-month revenue accelerating. We saw strength with Zoom Phone that had a record quarter with over 550 seats added. And so we're really excited about the future. We also last week announced Zoom Contact Center, which is our cloud contact center solution, which is fully integrated into the Zoom platform. So this is really a big year of transition for Zoom as we're moving from being a killer meeting app to a platform for communications and collaboration.
Right. Now, I'm curious if you can clarify Zoom's stance on Ukraine. I noticed that some parts of the country, the separatist areas, Crimea, et cetera, not serviced by Zoom, but Russia's not on the list of banned countries. Can you explain that?
So we do have some business in the region of Russia that is mostly through resellers, and we will continue, of course, to comply with all U.S. laws and sanctions, and we're very closely monitoring those.
Is there any consideration of self-sanctioning? Obviously, we saw Apple take a dramatic move today, Ford as well.
We certainly internally keep discussing all the options in how do we best support everyone that's in Ukraine region, and how do we do what's appropriate and what should we do as a good corporate citizen. So as this is a very quickly evolving situation, as you well know, we keep discussing it and monitoring it and trying to make decisions in a real-time basis.
And to this bigger question, you mentioned Zoom Phone earlier. Talk to us about how well these ancillary businesses are doing, and whether you see that sort of padding, any lack of growth you might see in the core part of the business over the longer term.
Yeah. So our strategy has been from the beginning to start with Zoom meetings and then continue to expand our share of wallet from our customers by selling them additional services. And Zoom Phone is a perfect example of that. We also see Zoom Rooms as organizations are thinking about welcoming their employees back to the office. The conference room strategy is really key to make sure that as they have employees working remotely, that it's inclusive and that they're bringing them together in a way that works for everybody, those that are inside the room and those that are without. Also, just as we expect the future of work to be hybrid, we also expect events to be hybrid as well. And our new product, Zoom Events, went GA last year. And that's really, as we look forward to these large events and people want to come together, but they also want to have that virtual component.
Okay. Zoom CFO Kelly Steckelberg, always great to have you here. Thank you, Kelly, for taking the time to join us. Coming up, Airbnb offering homes to tens of thousands of Ukrainians fleeing their country. My conversation with CEO Brian Chesky. Next, how he's making that a reality and his take on self-sanctioning in Russia. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Airbnb is offering free shelter for up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees fleeing the Russian invasion of their country. CEO Brian Chesky telling me he plans to work with neighboring European states to provide long-term stays as well. Take a listen to my conversation with him earlier today.
We announced yesterday that Airbnb, in partnership with Airbnb.org and our host community, have a goal to house up to 100,000 refugees fleeing Ukraine. Now, since we made that announcement, we've had over 30,000 people visit the page to learn about how to be a host or to donate. And we're just trying to get more word out, because basically the name of the game is the more hosts we have, the more refugees we can house.
What's the feedback you're getting from governments, from border crossings, about the situation that these refugees find themselves in the crosshairs of a war?
Yeah, I mean, we've reached out to 14 different governments in Central Eastern Europe, governments like Poland and Hungary and Romania and Germany. And what they're telling us is mostly thank you, because their last reports I heard, there were over 600,000 refugees that have been fleeing Ukraine. And so these governments need to find a way to house them. And what we can provide is an infrastructure. We've housed 54,000 refugees for free since we started Airbnb, and we've housed over 100,000 people in need for all different events for free. So I think we're being viewed, I hope, as a solution to a problem that they have. We can be a great partner, and I think they're appreciative of the support and the help.
What's been the response from hosts in these countries? Has there been an outpouring of support?
Yeah, I mean, it's just starting, obviously, in the last 24 hours, but we have had a large response so far. Just to give you a point of reference, 2 years ago, when the pandemic initially, of course, broke out, we worked with the French government, for example, to provide housing for workers in the front line. Tens of thousands of hosts stepped up. We had tens of thousands of hosts step up to provide housing for Afghan refugees, and we're expecting a pretty big response. Again, the main thing we need to do is just make sure that in the kind of flood of all the noise going on, that people who have homes that have availability in these countries know that they can take in refugees.
Now, I know Airbnb has a significant number of listings in Ukraine, given the number of short-term rentals I see in Kyiv, in Lviv, in Odessa. Do you have employees in Ukraine? And what is the status of your operations and hosts there?
Yeah, we don't have employees. We don't have a meaningful number of employees in Central Eastern Europe. We're primarily in certain hubs. Now, as you imagine, we have thousands of listings in countries in all over Central and Eastern Europe. And so our big focus right now we're focused on two big priorities. Number one, we were trying to make sure that our hosts and our community is safe. So we're doing a lot of outreach to our hosting guests in countries all over Central Eastern Europe. The second focus we have is try to house as many refugees as possible. And this entire refugee effort, Emily, really started 3 days ago. You know, it was Thursday, Friday, it became apparent that there were going to be hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Ukraine. And so we've worked all weekend through yesterday to be able to mobilize this effort.
Now, several companies have been self-sanctioning, pulling back their business operations in Russia. We just saw Apple pause all product sales in Russia. I know Airbnb also has a number of listings in Russia. Will you consider halting business there? What kind of conversations are you having?
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, we have our hands full right now because we made this huge commitment to house up to 100,000 refugees. That being said, I'll say two things. Number one, you know, we are going to cooperate with the U.S. government. We're in constant contact with them and support of whatever sanctions that they intend to impose. Number two, as a practical matter, a lot of the sanctions that have been imposed on the Russian banks in Russia have limited our ability to do business, the ability of people in Russia to receive money, and the ability of people in Russia to pay. So as a practical matter, a lot of our business is probably going to be on pause just from the inability to be able to pay. But we are looking at other steps. As you can imagine, we're just triaging right now.
So on that note, how are you expecting the war to impact travel overall across Europe? I mean, what are you bracing for here?
Hard to know. I don't really know what is going to unfold over the coming weeks and months. But what I will say is that whatever happens in Europe, our business is incredibly resilient. I mean, we have nearly every type of home and nearly every type of community at nearly every price point. And I think what the last 2 years have shown is however the world changes, our business can adapt. And so, you know, we continue to ask ourselves, how can we help in this time of need? The most important way we can help right now is housing people that need a place to stay. But, you know, I'm sure this is going to have a disruption on European travel, but we'll be able to adapt to whatever that disruption is.
Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky there. You can catch more of my interview with Chesky at Bloomberg.com. All right, coming up, crypto and the war in Ukraine. We're going to be joined by Starkiller Capital's Lee Drogan to talk about the role of crypto in this conflict and whether it could become a tool to circumvent sanctions. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Time now for our crypto report. I want to bring in our crypto contributor, Sonali Basak, as we see Bitcoin surging for a second day. Sonali, are we seeing Bitcoin decoupling from traditional markets here, beginning to trade on its own? And is this being influenced by what's happening in
Yeah,
Ukraine?
there's a few really interesting things happening in the market here, Emily. You have Bitcoin prices themselves getting closer now to $44,000, really getting lift here the last couple of days. And if you take a look at the prices here, you take a look at a Bitcoin price that's risen over the last 2 or 3 days, really much higher than 4 days ago, while stocks in that period over the last 2 days have dropped, where there's a correlation just about a week or so ago that it looks like it's starting to break off. I also want to take a look here at Ethereum prices, because you have Ethereum here now reaching about $3,000, and it also has had a significant lift the last couple of days. Now, when you take a look at volumes, you see that Ethereum also closely tied to a lot of stable coins, a lot of discussion around stable coins and the value of them in this new era where there's a lot of uncertainty. Besides Ethereum, you're seeing a lift in stable coins like Binance, the US dollar, and Tether. And so let's see, when volumes are really very high in those assets, how much this can sustain into the next couple of days.
All right, Shonali, stick with us. I want to continue this conversation about crypto and the role in the Ukrainian war now with our next guest, Lee Drogan from Starkiller Capital. Lee, you've been tweeting furiously about some of these issues, and I'm curious what you read into the rise in crypto. Is this solely to do with what's happening in Russia and Ukraine? Is it because there's simply more demand there?
There's definitely a spot bid that's independent of other risk assets. And, as you just pointed out, the correlations have definitely broken off. Specifically, we still have a VIX, equity VIX above 30, which historically has led to incredibly high correlations between crypto and equities. We've also seen, on-chain analytics as well as spot flow coming from different exchanges that basically says there's something between 3 and 4 times the amount of volume in ruble to BTC or ETH pairs on these centralized exchanges. And that's a one-way trade, obviously, right now. So there's definitely a bid coming out of that area of the world for obvious reasons. People are trying to get the hell out of rubles. How long that lasts is definitely a question, because the Russians are cutting off, all FX flows out of the country. And at some point, you're just not going to be able to use a card or a bank account to put any more money into these exchanges.
So look, certainly we're seeing crypto be used to support the Ukrainian resistance effort in incredibly powerful ways. There's also this major concern that the Russians could use cryptocurrency to circumvent sanctions. Do you see that as a real risk?
I don't think it's a reasonable scenario today. Come back in 3 or 4 years from now, maybe sooner, and maybe the market is liquid and large enough to the point where it could support that kind of evasion. But today, it wouldn't be possible. Basically, one, they have capital controls on everything at this point. So you've got to try and get it out of a bank account and onto a centralized exchange. That's hard enough. And in that part of the world, there really aren't that many DeFi direct on-ramps either. And so getting into DeFi isn't really that easy. But even if you were able to get it into a CeFi exchange, so you're going to do this in Bitcoin, which really isn't a great medium of transfer given its volatility. And there really aren't enough DeFi stablecoin pairs between the ruble and USD or EUR to make this a viable solution for getting around these types of things. And so it's really up to the CeFi exchanges to make sure that they are complying, with all of the sanctions and regulatory issues. And it seems like they have been so far. It's hard to believe that somebody could get enough money into DeFi at this point to really evade what they're attempting to.
Lee, and I'm really curious here. You make this point on capital controls and Russia's ability to really clamp down on people who are the ordinary citizens who are trying to move their money into crypto. And I'm wondering what that says more broadly about a government's ability to stop people from transacting in cryptocurrencies when they need to.
Yeah, well, look, there's a very good reason why people like me deeply believe in what's going on in DeFi. And it's not for some crazy libertarian reason. It's because of things like this. The United States is only one country on this earth, and there are a lot of other places where you don't want to be holding your entire net worth in some, kangaroo currency. And the ruble has been terrible for a decade now. So I think it's a very important, concept that this ecosystem ends up flourishing. What you're also seeing right now is this battle between centralized stablecoins and decentralized algorithmic stablecoins. Terra Luna is going crazy right now because there's a massive inflow of capital into that protocol because it's a decentralized stablecoin. There is no fiat bank account that a government can regulate and clamp down on and take your stablecoin, whereas USDC or some of these other centralized stablecoins, they can absolutely do that. There's literal dollars sitting in a vault somewhere. So I think there's a very interesting difference between those two frameworks.
Yeah, it's interesting. Luna is definitely worth discussing at some point again soon. But I do want to also get your thoughts here, Lee, on this idea of what you called the cryptoization of Forex, and this idea that there really are only a couple of currencies here that convert easily. To what extent do we see what's going on in the world today accelerating that move from traditional foreign exchange as we know it to crypto?
Yeah, this is absolutely inevitable. And there are a lot of things in crypto that I don't think are completely inevitable. This is one of them. Trading with a bank where they're taking this huge spread for you to move dollars into euro or yen or whatever is absolutely going to go away, no matter how big that is. There's going to be a curve pool for every one of these pairs, and firms like ours are going to provide liquidity to those pairs and be the capital. It's inevitable. The spreads will be smaller, the fees will be smaller, you'll be able to do it instantaneously. All of the framework for this at scale is in place today. It's literally just a matter of liquidity in the system at this point.
Lee, you have been tweeting furiously about what's been going on in Russia. You said earlier that you were speaking with your family there, that your family had no clue what's going on, zero idea what's about to happen to the economy. All they get is government propaganda. It's scary in the worst Orwellian way. What do you think about big tech's responsibility here? We're seeing Apple pull products from the country, Ford as well. We assume there will be more. But how else can businesses step up?
Yeah, it's sad. Look, my wife's parents are 60. They've lived in Russia their entire lives. They're not digital natives, right? And so they're very much dependent on a specific flow of information, as is much of that country. The concept that everybody has access to a VPN and good sources of information is completely false, obviously. And to expect everybody to do that would be false as well. Do big tech companies have an obligation? No, look, they're companies. They don't have an obligation to do anything but make money. That's just the reality of it. Do they have a moral obligation at some point? I would say that, each of these individual CEOs, it would behoove them to, at this point, attempt to do the right thing. Apple makes how many tens of billions of dollars in profit a quarter? I mean, yeah, look, I think at some point they have to put some values above making, what's the margin that they're going to lose off of clamping down on certain things to attempt to move this along a little faster. I think that may be smart.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that personal experience, and our hearts go out to your wife's parents. Thank you for joining us as well. Lee Drogan, Starkiller Capital, along with Bloomberg, Shanali Basic. Appreciate it. Coming up, remember that 19-year-old Elon Musk offered $5,000 to stop tracking his jet? Well, he didn't stop. And instead, he's now adding Russian oligarchs to the mix. Our conversation with Jack Sweeney coming up next. This is Bloomberg. Well, he made headlines and caused a few headaches by tracking Elon Musk's jet. Now, 19-year-old Jack Sweeney is at it again, but this time he's tracking jets owned by some of Russia's richest oligarchs following the invasion of Ukraine. We don't know for certain if the millionaires and billionaires are the ones on board, but thanks to Sweeney's programming and Twitter bots, we can track the plane's movement around the world. Joining me now, Jack Sweeney himself, founder of Ground Control and tracker of billionaires. I'm also joined by our Ed Ludlow. Jack, why did you go from tracking Elon Musk's to Russian oligarchs? What are you trying to achieve here?
Well, people asked, they knew I had the tracking ability of all these aircraft, and I found the list of these oligarchs and Putin on all that, so I just started tracking them because people wanted me to.
Well, that's a pretty straightforward answer, Jack. Give us a sense of the technology that goes into this. How do you make this happen?
Yeah, so ever since like 9/11, there's this new technology called ADS-B where all the planes are required to transmit their location through their transponder. So there's all these websites and companies that receive this data, and I get that data and I'm able to analyze it in my program and post it to Twitter.
Now, we've noticed quite a few of these jets going to interesting places. Are you seeing any trends? Where are they right now?
They're pretty much all over the world. You know, the United States and a few of that all, you know, just from Russia to Russia, but no specific trend of leaving.
And Jack, you kind of answered pretty straightforward. You did this because people asked you to do it, right? We've been following you a little while now in terms of you tracking Elon Musk's jet. But what's in it for you? I mean, you're a young guy, respectfully. What's the rationale here?
Well, I just have a lot of interest in aviation, and now there's some good attention to everything I'm doing. So it's fun to track these planes and code the stuff and create the Twitter accounts.
Do you feel like you have some sort of moral obligation here? Does that play into this at all?
Well, people wanted it, so I mean, they can do whatever they want with it. There's people that seem to think that these people shouldn't be allowed in the United States or other countries. So there seems to be some interest in it that way, that they don't want these type of people.
So Jack, previously you'd had some engagement with Elon Musk about your tracking of his jet. Do you mind to give us an update on where you kind of left that?
Well, he seemed to no longer be interested in anything, and then he ended up blocking me after all the media about the whole account and everything went out in public. And he got a higher level of blocking, but seemed to give up on that, and now he doesn't really seem to care anymore.
So, to that point, it sounds like you're going to continue to do this no matter what Elon has to say about it or not.
Yeah.
Is there somewhere you want to take this, Jack? I mean, what's next?
I'd like to grow a website rather than just be on Twitter, so I have more options than just creating Twitter posts.
Jack, tell me a little bit about you. What's your background? How did you learn to program in this way and program these Twitter bots to, because it's very specific, right? You get a lot of data from the system in terms of where a plane is, its location, but you've set this up in a really specific way, basically based on takeoff, landing, and the city of origin for that plane. Walk us through it.
Yeah, so I had some aviation experience. My dad works in aviation, and I knew a little bit of coding, and I just had interested in all of it. And during COVID, I had a lot of free time, so I just started messing around with it, especially with Elon. You know, I had an interest in him, and I knew he had a private jet. So I just had the idea to create a Twitter bot, because there's a lot of different type of bots on Twitter, and I created the plane tracking one.
What do your parents think about all this, since you mentioned your dad?
They think it's pretty cool, and all their friends know about it, and they think it's pretty cool too.
All right, well, we'll keep watching those trackers. Jack Sweeney, founder of Ground Control, and our Ed Ludlow. Ed, you know, obviously this is a story that you've continued to follow for a while. What do you make of Jack's determination here?
Yeah, there's two sides to this. First of all, the reason I love this show, Emily, and I love working with you is that this is about technology, right? A 19-year-old that taught himself these skills, and he's basically giving a lens into the life of billionaires, rich people that you wouldn't otherwise have. And then you have the moral side of it, right? There's a lot of outrage in Europe about several oligarchs, what they're doing, how they're speaking, where they're conducting business. So it kind of gives you a lens into that as well.
Well, and it's certainly interesting seeing where these planes are. I know you've been looking very closely at the maps. Are there any interesting trends that you've pulled out?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The debate right now is over no-fly zone, right? So we just had news after market on Tuesday that United will stop flying over Russian airspace. That's a commercial carrier, of course, but we're tracking the movements of several oligarchs, billionaires, one being Roman Abramovich, for example, the owner of Chelsea FC in the UK, because he might be involved in peace talks somewhere along the way.
All right, we'll keep watching. Ed, thank you. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. We're going to be joined tomorrow by Brett Taylor, Salesforce co-CEO, off the back of the company's earnings results, and Anthony Noto, CEO of SoFi. You won't want to miss those conversations. This is Bloomberg.